December brings the shortest days of the year. The sun reaches its lowest point in its procession across the heavens. This marks the midpoint of winter. Having endured months of bleak conditions being confined indoors, our northern ancestors, just as we do today, felt the need to find ways to assuage the feelings of boredom and despondency which the season could induce. Without the modern comforts we enjoy today, winter took a much greater emotional toll, and could even threaten the lives of those who were not fully prepared to face it. It is this need for solace in the dark night of the soul, as well as the key astronomical event on December 21st, known as the winter solstice, which gave rise to the ancient midwinter religious festivals and their spiritual successor, Christmas. The winter solstice held both tragic and hopeful spiritual significance to the ancients. It took place 3 months after the fall equinox, when, in an act of cosmic treachery, the solar god had been mortally wounded. For in this imperfect world, the greatest good is often met with resistance. In the Freemasonic tradition, the 3 killers of enlightenment, fear, ignorance, and greed, correspond to the 3 winter months in their houses, responsible for the death of the Savior, who was martyred in his effort to bring light to the world. As a metaphor for the human soul, this process was representative of the struggle for spiritual ascension against the lower parts of human nature which keep the soul in bondage. The winter solstice symbolized the gates of heaven, at which the higher nature repeatedly succumbs to the lower, preventing entry, highlighting the apparent futility of the great work within the material world. During this astronomical event, the sun is at its lowest point in the sky and appears to stop moving for 3 days. The word solstice in Latin means the sun stands still. As when something dies, the body ceases to move, this was a sign that the god had perished. After this period of 3 days, the sun appears to resume motion, changing direction in a northward procession. This was a sign that the god had been reborn. When conditions seemed to be at their worst, the greatest miracle took place. This was the promise of salvation, which the deity embodied in his own regenerative power, conferring onto humanity in the world. Despite this repeated thwarting of his efforts, the spirit of good persists. Midwinter festivals were structured around 2 major aspects of this solar event, beginning on the solstice and ending when the sun began to resume motion, the archaic predecessors to Christmas and New Year's, 2 holidays which were originally one and the same. While this was an important point in the god's renewal, sometimes the full resurrection was considered to take place over the next 3 months, being completed by the spring equinox. The process of the sun's resurrection illuminated a great metaphysical truth, that darkness was the ultimate source of creation. As the light is born out of the darkness, just as a child is conceived within the darkness of the womb, in it is contained all possibilities, a primordial chaos from which all forms are ordered. Quote, "Light is a manifestation of life, and is therefore posterior to life. That which is anterior to light is darkness, in which light exists temporarily, but darkness permanently. As life precedes light, its only symbol is darkness, and darkness is considered as the veil which must eternally conceal the true nature of abstract and undifferentiated being." When we think of Christmas, themes of joy, festivity, charity, and human connection might come to mind. One of the most ancient midwinter festival traditions, which perhaps had the most influence in shaping Christmas, was that of the Romans. Theirs was celebrated on December 17th and over the following 2 to 7 days. The former was known as Saturnalia. This was a preparatory observance of the New Year feast of Calendar on January 1st, when the power of the sun was thought to be returning. It was for this reason that Calendar held supreme religious importance. Yet despite this, Saturnalia was by far the most popular, no doubt due to its rites of revelry. It was referred to by a Roman poet as the best of days. And yet strangely, it was not the sun god Sol who was honored on Saturnalia. When the power of the sun had been extinguished, a peculiar, ancient memory resurfaced. The memory of a golden age, a time when another king ruled the heavens and human beings lived in paradise on earth. His name was Saturn, a sovereign god, a god of plenty, of beginnings and ends, the primordial, universal monarch from the union of the earth goddess Gaia and the sky god Uranus. Under Saturn's reign, there was bounty upon the earth, an abundance of food and resources, and so there was no need for humans to compete with or subjugate one another for material gain. They lived in a state of innocence and harmony, virtuous by nature. An association was made between Saturn and the Greek Kronos, and in the writings of the poet Hesiod, we are given further detail with regard to the Golden Age. Quote, "Men lived like gods without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil and grief. Miserable age rested not on them. But with legs and arms never failing they made merry, with feasting beyond the reach of all devils. When they died, it was as though they were overcome with sleep. And they had all good things, for the fruitful earth unforced bare them fruit abundantly, and without stint. They dwelt in ease and peace." In this era, it is said that human beings were bestowed with godlike qualities, and the gods lived among them. They did not age or fall ill, and lived long lives, only dying when they decided to pass on, at which point they would become daimons, spirit beings which could be seen visibly. It is also said that animals had the ability to speak like humans, a belief which is likely responsible for the legend that on Christmas Eve, animals have the ability to speak. However beneficent and wise, Cronus, or Saturn, had dethroned his father Uranus to come to power, and became paranoid of a prophecy which stated that he would in turn be overthrown by one of his offspring. And so he became cruel, consuming his children in an effort to avoid his fate. Nonetheless, he was usurped by his son Zeus, causing a cataclysmic end to the Golden Age. He and his consorts were cast into the abyss of Tartarus and restrained. Thus, in later depictions, he was bound at the feet, only being unshackled during Saturnalia. Under the reign of Zeus, human beings were made to be inferior, and when they did not follow the gods, were destroyed and remade, initiating a progressive devolution of the human race. With each new age and formation of man, he fell to a lower state as a form of punishment. From the Golden Age to the Silver Age to Bronze Age, and so forth. The myth of the Golden Age and the subsequent fall of man can be seen not only in the Greco-Roman, but also Hindu and Judeo-Christian traditions. It is famously portrayed in J.R.R. Tolkien's concept of Middle-earth and the fall of Numenor, which was also inspired by the Greek Atlantean myth and the destruction of an advanced pre-Diluvian society. During Saturnalia, class distinctions were temporarily dissolved. Slaves were waited on by their masters and were allowed to speak and act freely. Mock kings would be elected to preside over the celebrations, a guise of Saturn himself, symbolizing his temporary rule while the solar king was away. This role reversal was a nostalgic reenactment of the idyllic Saturnian era, when all people were equal and free. Shops, schools, and government buildings were closed, and certain moral restrictions such as gambling were loosened. During the religious ceremonies on the 17th, a sacred fire would be kindled by the Vestal Virgins and kept lit until the new year. These were a group of priestesses who took vows of celibacy and religious devotion. The symbolism of the sacred fire may have been that through each new cycle, before each beginning and after each end, the imperishable, eternal flame of the Creator remains at the heart of creation. In the days following, people celebrated by feasting, drinking, playing music, gambling, and socializing. The idea was to make merry and invoke the Golden Era, where everyone was happy, possibly in an effort to bring about its return. Holly and ivy were used as symbolic decoration. Remaining green year-round, they were symbols of the eternal nature of spirit, which renewed the world. People exchanged gifts, especially candles, as symbols of this undying light. As the paragons of perfection, the ancients often sought to do as the gods did in order to become like them. And so this may have been symbolic of the divine gifts of Saturn during the Golden Age. Calenday featured similar rites, with a stronger emphasis on gift-giving in order to bring luck for the coming year. As to why Saturn was worshipped at this time, there are a few possible explanations. The Neoplatonic philosopher Porphyry suggested it was because the sun passed through the astrological house of Capricorn during the winter solstice, which was known to be ruled by Saturn. As a god of generation, he may have been seen as responsible for the resurrection of the sun. As the god of time, he would sensibly stand as the gatekeeper between the old year and the new. Also, being a god of agriculture, he would have been seen as having the power to bless the crops for the upcoming season, which were to be sown in January. While most of our Christmas traditions seem to trace back to the Romans, we will nonetheless now turn our attention towards the evidence for an ancient midwinter festival in the British Isles and Nordic states. The nature of this festival, and therefore how it might connect to Christmas, is less understood due to lack of documentation. Despite this, there is enough information to suggest that this was indeed an important religious observance in the same manner as the other solar holidays we have discussed. The oldest testament to this can be found in the alignments of certain ancient mound sites. One of the most impressive of these is Newgrange in Ireland, the entrance of which is aligned so that the rays of the rising midwinter sun shine directly into the main chamber. On the Isle of Orkney, north of Scotland, the burial mounds of Maes Howe aligns in a similar manner with the rays of the setting midwinter sun. In southern England are the Cursuses, earthen structures resembling long, narrow trenches, which likely had some ritual function. The largest of these, in Dorset, stretches over 6 miles long and points directly towards the midwinter sunset. These structures do suggest an ancient religious observance of the midwinter sun. However, it should be noted that of the hundreds that exist, only a small number of them are known to have such alignments, and many do not have any identifiable alignments at all. This makes it difficult to establish for certain the existence of a widespread solar cult, or any continuation of solar worship into the Iron Age or later periods. Evidence in myth is also lacking, such as in the Irish Ulster cycle, showing mostly evidence for the seasonal festivals. Despite this lack of continuity, there is still enough evidence to suggest that the midwinter festivals were firmly entrenched in European cultures long before the creation of Christmas. St. Patrick himself wrote in the 5th century about the Irish pagans who worshipped the sun. Bede stated that for the Anglo-Saxon English, the most important annual festival took place on December 24th, which was called Modranicht, or Mother Night. This marked the new year, wherein the people would keep watch throughout the night. Snorri Sturluson claimed that the Nordic peoples celebrated the ancient pagan festival of Yule, which involved sacrifice for good crop, in contrast to the Winter Nights festival mentioned last episode, which allegedly made sacrifice for an easy winter. This relates to the Romans' propitiation of their agricultural god at the same time. Yule was said to last for 3 days. An Icelandic account tells of a warrior who postponed single combat until afterwards, so as not to break the sanctity of the festival. More evidence comes to us in a series of denunciations made by churchmen, some of whom were the most renowned fathers of the early medieval church, which spanned west into Germany. Archbishop Wulfstan of York, whose province had recently seen an influx of paganism from a Viking settlement, complained about, quote, the nonsense which is performed on New Year's Day in various kinds of sorcery. Among these appeared to be divination magic to see what the new year would bring. Finally, in Wales, we have strong literary evidence to suggest the existence of their midwinter festival called the New Year Feast. The last and perhaps most important piece of evidence can be seen in an attempt by the English crown to move the New Year, and thus the newly adopted Feast of Nativity, to March, in an effort to make sense of the Roman months and its original calendar, which put March as the first month. This change remained in place for almost 600 years, from 1155 to 1752. Despite this, virtually everyone continued to practice their religious rites centered around the new year in December and January. This alone is enough to suggest a long-standing pre-Christian tradition that existed in the cultures whose legislators unsuccessfully attempted to uproot it. Despite these changes, all emotional attachment to the original dates remained firm. While we don't know exactly how these ancient festivals were celebrated, we can probably assume that they involved both religious ceremony and communal festivities, not unlike the Romans. While the midwinter festivals suggested hopefulness and optimism among those who observed them, we must also acknowledge the dark spiritual forces that people believed to be at work during this time. After all, it was the death of the sun, a temporary plunging into darkness, which we know is symbolically connected to evil. Like Samhain, there appears to be a supernatural element of danger, as evidenced by the records of defensive magic, even surviving into the Victorian era. The original purpose of hanging mistletoe seems to have been to ward against evil spirits, preventing them from entering the home. It was common in Ireland and Scotland to keep mistletoe hanging until New Year's had ended to keep the fairies away. One account tells of a belief held among the superstitious that for every twig left behind after the removal of greenery, that one goblin would haunt the home. In Germanic paganism, there's the concept of the wild hunt, which scholars have connected to the midwinter festival of Yule. This was a host of supernatural beings in pursuit of humans, a sort of reckoning led by a god or goddess, in the case of its Germanic form, Wodan, or Odin as he is known in Scandinavia. They were believed to fly through the sky at night, often astride war horses. This hunting party was variously described as being comprised of drogers, Valkyries, elves, or ghostly dogs. Drogers were essentially the proto-zombie, animated corpses of the dead, and said to guard the treasures buried in their tombs. Valkyries were female godlike beings who were said to rule the fates of those in battle, summoning fallen warriors to their designated hall of Asgard in the afterlife. Elves were a humanoid supernatural race of beings, said to live in the wilderness. The ancient elves of Germanic belief were distinctly different from later concepts of the Fae folk, which we explored in earlier episodes. They were described as similar to human in appearance and stature, but more fair, similar to Tolkien's portrayal in his novels. It is now suggested that this was the case for ancient Irish and Anglo-Saxon concepts of similar beings as well. This is a good example of how ancient beliefs can change or become misconstrued from their original meaning over time. As people began to abandon the old religions to Christianity, their gods became dark and strange. The wild hunt is theorized to have gone through this metamorphism as well, emphasizing only the dark and chthonic qualities of what were, in reality, dynamic concepts. Folklorist Jacob Grimm believed that in its earliest conception, the wild hunt visited, quote, the land at some holy tide, bringing welfare and blessing, accepting gifts and offerings of the people, floating unseen through the air, perceptibly in cloudy shapes, in the roar and howl of the winds. He believed that Christianization reinvented it as, quote, a pack of horrid specters dashed with dark and devilish ingredients. In some parts of Christian Britain, they were thought to drag the souls of the damned to hell. Despite this, it appears that the wild hunt, in some sense, did serve a Grim Reaper-type function, collecting the souls of those who were fated to die, and serving as an omen of death and war to whoever witnessed it. The wild hunt was said to commence at the fall equinox and end at the spring equinox, reaching its peak during the winter solstice. The identification of the wild hunt as a winter phenomenon is obvious, as winter is associated with death, not only because of its effect on nature, but also because many more people die in winter than any other season. It is often associated with strong winter storms and winds. The wild hunt would even make its way to Britain in 1127, being recounted in the Peterborough Chronicle as an actual event with several reliable witnesses. Quote, many men both saw and heard a great number of huntsmen hunting. These huntsmen were black, huge and hideous, and rode on black horses and black he-goats, and their hounds were jet black, with eyes like saucers and horrible. This was seen in the very deer park of the town of Peterborough, and in all the woods that stretch from that same town to Stamford, and in the night monks heard them sounding and winding their horns. Perhaps both the negative and positive aspects of the wild hunt are part of its nature, a dualistic nature, that could come in the form of punishment or reward. in a karmic dispensation of judgment, bringing resolution to all things and clearing the slate for the new year. It would make sense that there would be a belief in divine judgment coming at the end of each year, just as it came at the end of life. Perhaps this could help explain a more familiar figure of the season, one who rides through the night sky, leaving gifts for good children and coal for the misbehaved. We will now turn our attention to Christmas itself, which in the context of the midwinter festival begs the question, why was it observed at the same time? In fact, there is no reference in the Bible to the date of Christ's birth, and best estimates put it somewhere in October. Furthermore, quote, "It now seems to be generally accepted that the nativity stories are an extreme case in the Christian Gospels of inventions by authors to place Christ in the traditional Jewish salvation history." Ronald Hutton, The Stations of the Sun. With so little foundation for a historical birth, why was December 25th identified as the date? The reason was political and tactical, relating back to the process of syncretism, which we discussed in the Easter episode. The church saw the popularity of the midwinter festivals, which were even celebrated by Christians themselves. Instead of trying to eradicate such a beloved tradition, it was estimated to be much easier to allow people to retain their religious customs in form and simply adapt them to the worship of Christ. Quote, "It was a custom of the pagans to celebrate on the same 25th of December the birthday of the sun, at which they kindled lights in token of the festivity. In these solemnities and revelries, the Christians also took part. Accordingly, when the doctors of the church perceived that the Christians had leaning to this festival, they took counsel and resolved that the true nativity should be solemnized on that day." Cyrus. The placement of Christmas on this day was done by Roman decree in 354 AD. This replaced the cult of the unconquered sun in Rome, which itself had replaced Saturnalia in 274, both of which were done with political impetus to unite the increasingly factionalizing Roman Empire. In 567, the Council of Tours formalized the 12 days of Christmas, from the 25th to January 6th, which was dedicated to the baptism of Christ under the Greek name Epiphany. Several other holy days related to the events in the life of Jesus and his disciples were invented to fill the period of days. This extension was an attempt to absorb the pagan feasts into one Christian festal cycle. Christmas would obviously retain preeminence among them, and the ancient practice of the New Year's gifting would be transferred onto it and given new meaning. The story of the wise men and their veneration of the infant Jesus, bestowing gifts of frankincense, gold, and myrrh, would come to capture the imagination of medieval Europe. Gifting came to symbolize the acknowledgement of and devotion to Christ as the Savior. Monarchs would take part in this custom as a gesture of allegiance to the church. The invention of Christmas would prove to be problematic for Christians, spurring confusion over its true nature, so much so that Pope Leo the Great himself felt compelled to remind people that the object of worship during Christmas was Christ and not the sun. Indeed, the similarities are all too evident, as both deities were savior figures and both underwent a resurrection. Adding to this confusion was the allegorical use of light in association with Christ, as he himself declared, quote, "I am the light of the world. The one who follows me will never walk in darkness." This identity crisis would remain unresolved for hundreds of years, coming to a head during the Protestant Reformation and the Church of England's scrutiny of any religious tradition that did not have scriptural basis. Inevitably, the holiday would become a focal point of religious and political conflict, a struggle between theological reformists and the masses who insisted on retaining their folkways. Christmas was subjected to a series of unsuccessful campaigns of suppression and even outright abolition, before finally being left alone. However, for a significant period in the Middle Ages, it remained largely unmolested. Political and religious authorities, and everyone from royalty to peasantry, embraced it, along with many pagan symbols and rites which were infused into the Christian holy day. We will now turn our attention to the celebration of Christmas in medieval Europe. This was much more akin to the Saturnalian festivals than the holiday that we recognize today. Instead of private, low-key observances in the home, medieval Christmas was much more communal, centered around public gatherings and merrymaking. The streets would be filled with people celebrating. People enjoyed caroling, dancing, gaming, storytelling, and even cross-dressing. Like the mock kings of Saturnalia, a person would be appointed to guide the festivities, taking on a king of fools, jester-like persona. He was known as the Lord of Misrule. Rites of hospitality and charity were also common, with nobility hosting feasts on a grandiose scale. In 1377, King Richard II hosted a feast for over 10,000 people. The meal consisted of 28 oxen, 300 sheep, and 200 tubs of wine, requiring the services of over 2,000 cooks. Hospitality was practiced at all levels of society, with even the poor being expected to open their doors to the needy stranger. Another popular custom was that of entertainments, such as song, dance, and theater, performed by the lower classes for the crown, in exchange for donations and gifts. This was known as mumming, derived from the Greek momo, meaning mask. These entertainers would don colorful costumes and disguises, spangled with bells and sequin. Elaborate visages of heroic knights and creatures such as peacocks, dragons, and devils were created for the mummers' plays. Groups of people would also travel from home to entertain families. While all of this may portray a relatively romantic picture, it was sometimes less so than it appeared. Kings would be criticized for extorting gifts from their subjects, and the gentry would complain about having to oblige the solicitations of the poor. At certain points in history, mumming fell out of favor with authorities due to people using it as an opportunity to commit crimes. It seems these festive entertainments may have been done primarily out of necessity, as the poor were struggling financially due to the lack of gainful employment in the winter, when there was no farming to be done. Eventually, the practices died out with the creation of the middle class. It was noted that once people were no longer financially struggling, that they stopped mumming. Many pagan midwinter symbols found their way into early Christmas and carried right through to today. Just as the Romans and most other ancient cultures used greenery and light in their midwinter festivals, so too did the medieval Christians. The motivation for the use of these is obvious, as they provide comfort and reassurance during the season which deprived people of green leaves, light, and warmth. As magical tools, they would have been used to manifest these things back into the world, being symbols of the forces that create them. Holly and ivy were used especially, and it is said that there was an old belief that ivy represented the female element and holly the male, their combination representing divine union which begets new life and correlates to spring. Much of their religious significance was lost by the Middle Ages, but they were still used for decoration, being some of the only available greenery of the season. They could be seen filling the halls of all manner of buildings, from churches, castles, to the homes of commoners. A publication in 1712 wrote, "The middle aisle is a pretty shady walk, and the pews look like so many arbors on either side of it. The pulpit had such clusters of ivy, holly, and rosemary about it, that the light fellow in our pew took occasion to say that the congregation heard the word out of a bush, like Moses." The hanging of mistletoe in the doorway seems to be another foliage rite with ancient origins, and was also eventually adapted into a more innocuous and secular form, the kissing bush, now simply referred to as mistletoe, the main plant out of which this bush was constructed. It later became a popular tradition in Victorian society. It is interesting to note that the kissing bush seems to be an attempt to invoke the wild spirit of pagan festivals like Saturnalia within a confined and controlled space, which allowed the conservative Victorian society to cautiously explore a certain loosening of social restrictions. It was given a certain romantic mystique by the writer Washington Irving, who identified it as a beloved and sacred plant of the Druids. The second pagan symbol brought into Christmas ceremonies was light. This was popular all over Europe, with candles commonly being lit on Christmas Eve. This was known as Candlemas. The same can be said for the Christmas log, which was large enough so that it could burn throughout the entire festival. Its embers would then be used to start a new fire for the new year. This log went by many names in many areas, but is most widely known today as the Yule log. Its specific origin is uncertain, but it would make sense for it to have originated in Scandinavia, where winters are coldest and require large, long-burning fires to stay warm. These practices may have been a remnant of older sacred fire and candle rites. While their purpose by that time was certainly practical, we do see some arcane significance attached to it, as the belief was often expressed that they provided spiritual protection for the home. This fusion of Christianity and paganism would eventually start a protracted conflict, beginning in the mid-16th century. Tensions were brewing as church services were being disrupted by drunken revelry. The trials of Christmas began in 1561, when the Scottish Kirk Calvinist Church declared, correctly, that the Papists had invented Christmas and all related feasts, with no basis in Scripture. It had sufficiently petitioned the government to an extent that it was able to dictate policy, and eventually overthrew the government altogether, proceeding to abolish Christmas wholesale. All forms of celebration were prohibited. Even the making of snowballs was illegal. In 1573, the Kirk tried 14 women for, quote, playing, dancing, and singing of filthy carols on Yule Day. The leaders of the craft guilds were prosecuted for idleness. Those who continued to hold feasts were excommunicated. Inspectors would even come to people's homes to search their kitchens for Christmas goose. This movement would spread to the Church of England, who until then had only taken a mildly critical stance. In exchange for military aid from Scotland, England agreed to give Kirk reformist influence. Upon a new evaluation by the Church, Christmas was deemed to be a mixture of Catholic superstition and godless hedonism, and restrictions of the same manner as Scotland were put into place. This would fuel an already growing animus towards the Protestant English Parliament, which had gained political power over the crown. On Christmas Day in 1647, riots erupted in several counties. Tensions between parliamentarians and royalists escalated into a civil war, with the abolition of Christmas being used as a rallying call, helping to engender overwhelming public support of the crown. Whatever resentment had been growing for the king among the people was put aside, now being looked upon favorably in comparison to Parliament, who had also burdened them with higher taxes and military quartering. But nonetheless, the rebellion was crushed, resulting in the execution of King Charles I and exile of his heir, ending Christmas as a holy day until the Restoration. This, however, was not able to stop secular observances, and without Christmas Mass, the festival would actually become even less Christian than before, ironically compounding the very issue that the Kirk had sought to resolve. Members of Parliament would complain of being kept awake at night by rowdy partygoers on Christmas Eve. In 1660, King Charles II marched his army into England and defeated the parliamentarians, restoring the crown and nullifying every legislation that had been passed since the coup had taken place. Christmas carried on much as it had before, now with the full support and participation of the monarchy. The next major historical period in the evolution of Christmas began in the 19th century. The industrialization of the West was a major influence in the course of its development. Authors like William Wordsworth, Washington Irving, and most notably Charles Dickens, used the idea of Christmas as an allegory for the moral reform that was needed to remediate the social division that had resulted from the emergence of business tycoons and an increasing stratification of economic classes. Just as the ancient Romans waxed nostalgia for the Golden Age, these writers turned to old traditions as an answer to the growing discontent, as models of virtue and harmony. Before this, employers, backed by government, didn't recognize Christmas and expected people to work. The sentiment being expressed by the media was that it was an archaic custom that had no place in the developed world. Despite this, there was a concern among the middle class of a growing disparity of wealth and a negative impact on familial bonds, as working parents were increasingly distanced from each other and their children. These authors sought to crystallize and express what was already being felt by the people. The pinnacle of these efforts came in 1843 with the release of A Christmas Carol by Dickens. Ebenezer Scrooge was an indictment of the selfishness that industrial society produced, and his arc outlined a redemptive path for the rich to transmute the very product of their avarice into a means of atonement through charity. He symbolically attached piety to the feast, and portrayed Christmas as being centered around the family and children, which was a radical departure from the public festivals of old. Prince Albert was also instrumental in this shift, having an image published of his family at home gathered around a Christmas tree. There is a common myth that the modern Christmas was primarily invented and peddled onto the public by industrialists seeking to sell more products. The reality is that the commercialism of Christmas was a response to the growing desire of the public to celebrate the holiday, and subsequently demanded more products. With more dispensable income, a newfound respect for the intimacy of the parent-child bond, and a need to keep them occupied while they were away, the toy industry experienced a massive boom. The last piece of the Christmas puzzle, the Rosetta Stone, the personification of the Christmas spirit, is of course Santa Claus. The idea of personifying Christmas was first conceived in the early 1600s by writers who described him as, quote, an old reverend gentleman in furred gown and cap. He was dubbed Father Christmas. At this point, he was akin to the Lord of Misrule, a more foolish rather than serious character, the embodiment of seasonal merriment. It was not until the historical Saint Nicholas of the Netherlands that this idea would begin to take its recognizable shape. Saint Nick was known for his charitable nature. The most famous example of this is his payment of a dowry, which the soon-to-be-wed daughter's father could not afford. He paid for the dowry by leaving gold in their shoes. This is the origin of stockings. Saint Nicholas would be used as part of the inspiration for the final iteration of Santa, developed in New York City by professor and writer Clement Clarke Moore in his poem, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." The description therein was not a mortal saint, but a magical being from the North Pole. The description contained many of the key elements we associate with Santa today: a portly elfin man with a bushy white beard, who flew through the sky on his sleigh, climbing down the chimney to leave gifts for children. Clarke's only motive for writing the poem was to amuse his own children. To his frustration, a copy was leaked to a newspaper and quickly became a sensation. The modern Santa was born in New York City. Christmas, with its new mascot, was poised for a revival and set to become the most popular holiday in the world. At this point, we will come full circle and bring the idea of Santa back to the ancient midwinter festivals. It is assumed by modern scholars that the only possible ancient inspiration for Santa was Odin and the Wild Hunt. Indeed, the description of the old bearded man flying through the night sky, enlisting the service of elves, bears a direct similarity. My personal theory, however, is that Santa, Odin's Wild Hunt, and Saturn can all be linked with the common myth theme of judgment. As I have demonstrated earlier, all three of these figures display a dualistic nature, capable of bringing about both reward and punishment, embodying both dark and light aspects, just as the observation of the winter solstice acknowledged both the darkness and the return of the light. This punitive aspect is only somewhat evident in the popular Western form of Santa, but in the old Alpine traditions, he is known to enlist the service of Krampus, a demon who comes to abuse and abduct misbehaved children. There are also similar figures, such as the Icelandic witch Grilla, who roams the streets during Christmas, also looking for unruly children to abduct. At one time, before the refocalizing of Christmas towards children, there was a feeling that everyone should take a moral inventory at the end of the year. Saturn represented abundance but also limitation. In Hinduism, Saturn is the god of karma, capable of swinging both ways in the act of judgment. He knows if you've been bad or good. The color of Saturn is black. Judges wear black robes in court. Saturn is the last planet, the last hurdle in the ascension through the spheres in Hermeticism. As the sun passes through Saturn's house on the winter solstice, he is the gatekeeper, between the end of the old cycle and the new. He is also the god of time, which encompasses the beginning and end and everything in between. Time and judgment are related because time will tell. All things resolve in time, and what is sown is inevitably reaped. It is not coincidental, then, that Saturn is an agricultural god. The seed, like the darkness, represents potential, and Saturn is there to make sure that our intentions and our actions correlate to how that potential solidifies through the spheres and condenses into form, from everything into one thing. Hence why Saturn is both abundance and limitation, why Saturn meant sacrifice, giving up all that could be for what will be. Saturn is also a god of freedom. Judgment brings freedom through absolution, relieving us of the weight of past mistakes. He may dash our hopes and dreams, show us the error of our ways, but at the end, descends from his throne in the north to bestow the gift of life, another chance to start anew. What can we learn from the history of this thing we call Christmas? Maybe that it is a testament to fundamental aspects of human nature, the need to celebrate life, to connect with one another, in spite of the whims and schemes of institutions who would seek to control or prevent it, or inject us with their own contrived ideas. The manner in which we observe may change, but the core spirit that drives us remains unmoved by the tide of history. Because what drives us comes from outside us, but what's outside is also within. We persist just as the sun keeps rising. There is always reason to celebrate, and nothing can stop us from doing so.
They cut me down, I leap up high. I am the light that will never, never die. I live in you if you live in me. I am the Lord of the dance of dreams. Just then, wherever you may be. I am the Lord.